welcome everyone to our last session for vocabulary of senses. Today we have Greer Valley, my esteemed colleague and a dear, a very dear individual who I hold dear and I hold in high regard. She's invited today Adrian van Wyk and Snotile Gumede to think with her around a series of projects that they'd initiated within the context of the University of Stellenbosch in 2015, 16, and in 2019 or 2021, I'm not too sure. So I'll give a short reading of her bio and just also give a description of the presentation itself, and then hand it over to the invited practitioners to speak about the two projects. Greer Valley is a lecturer in the Curatorial Public and Visual Cultures Department at the Wits School of Arts. She is a doctoral candidate, or rather, she has just recently finished her PhD. Congratulations. In art historical studies at the Michaelis School of Fine Art. She is a fellow at the Archive and Public Culture Initiative at the University of Cape Town. She currently serves on the board of the Africa South Arts Initiative and is a member of the Council of the KwaZulu-Natal Society of Arts. In 2019 and 2020, Greer was selected as a Getty Foundation, Mahasa Modern Art Histories in and Across Africa, South and Southeast Asia participant, and she formed part of the Dakar Art Biennale 2020 Selection Committee. Her current research and practice interests include curatorial interventions in museums and art institutions connected to South African colonial histories. She holds a bachelor's degree in architecture, an honors degree in visual studies, a master's degree in visual art, and a PhD in art historical studies. Okay. So today, the title of the presentation is Spectral Immaterialities, Reflections on the Chair. So I guess it's written in first-person narrative, so I'll quote, open quote, I guess. In 2015, I collaborated with the poetry collective InZync in a project to excavate the repository of the Stellenbosch University Museum archive. The outcome of our deep engagement with this space was the exhibition titled The Chair. In our reconsideration of this exhibition, my fellow collaborator, Adrian Diff van Wyk, and I returned to both the archives and the town of Stellenbosch to trace the afterlives of this project. Our purpose is dualfold: to retrace and introspectively deliberate facets of this project that continue to haunt and unsettle us, while simultaneously paying attention to the architectural landscape of Stellenbosch to garner insights into its haunting past and present. Through this dual exploration, we aspire to unearth and examine the spectral reverberations of the past that linger within both the project and the town's architectural fabric. So I hand it over to you, Greer, and Snotile and Adrian.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting us and having us here. Just want to say that the title has changed slightly, and you can see it on the screen, I hope. As we thought it might be interesting to reflect on both the exhibitions, the Chair and Acquisition List, as they followed each other, and they were created or conceptualized with the same kind of logic. And as Sinatemba mentioned, I'm joined here by two of my friends and colleagues, Snotile Gumede and Adrian van Wyk. And we will be looking at both exhibitions that took place at the Stellenbosch University Museum. Both projects were positioned as curatorial interventions into what we felt was a deeply racist institution, with display practices stuck in the past. Snotile's exhibition followed on from the Chair. I think there are about 3 years or 4 years between the two. And while we have spoken informally about the two interventions, we haven't really had the space to reflect on the work and to think about what it may have unsettled at the institution, or whether if they had any impact at all. And we're also thinking about the idea of an intervention in general, thinking about specifically interventions in museum contexts, whether they are effective as practices or just another way that the institution co-opts practitioners from the outside to perform decoloniality. Just some brief context about the museum. So the Stellenbosch University Museum is what it says it is. It's the University Museum of Stellenbosch University, and it is situated within the socio-political and historical context of apartheid and settler colonial history that Stellenbosch University embodies. The museum was officially opened to the public in 1991 and was made possible by a grant from Sasol, the South African energy and chemical company. And while Sasol has in subsequent years made no formal donations to the museum in terms of its operational funding or otherwise, the inclusion of Sasol in the name of the museum remained for more than 2 decades. In 2015, it was officially renamed to the Stellenbosch University Museum, or the US Museum. And what is called the Anthropology Collection was acquired after the closure of the Volkerkunde or Ethnology Department at the university. And the Cultural History Collection was donated by families of the owners of objects in the collection. For instance, the Diff collection in the Cultural History Department was a bequest from the Milan family, who provided strict conditions in terms of the display of objects. In 2014, the university appointed Bongani Mjijima, a museologist and former curator of the Luandle Migrant Labor Museum, as the director of the US Museum and successor to longtime director Lydia Duval. So the museum is organized internally in a manner typical of most public museums, with separate departments housing collections. And in this instance, what it sees as the separate museological disciplines of anthropology, cultural history, and fine art. Notably, its anthropology collection is framed as distinct from the cultural history collection. While the anthropology exhibition room is devoted to showing the material culture of non-urbanized Black African populations of Southern Africa, the cultural history collection, which does not have a designated specific exhibition room, but rather is shown throughout various displays in the building, is devoted to showing objects belonging to South African population of European descent and focused on Afrikaner histories. Contextualizing this way of displaying collections, displaying and archiving collections, Carolyn Hamilton and Elizabeth Rankin explained that the earliest historical and cultural museums in South Africa were based on a classificatory division between the disciplines of cultural history, which was concerned with the material culture and glorious history of a so-called civilized westernized society and their settler offshoot, and ethnology, or later ethnography. So in the US Museum, this is referred to as anthropology. And this is focused on what were regarded as the timeless traditions, the life and habits of indigenous peoples presumed to be primitive and located somewhere earlier on the evolutionary scale. The exclusion of African cultural history or contemporary African cultural history from the cultural history collection in a contemporary post-1994 South African University Museum should raise questions about the values and culture of that institution. And draws attention to what Patricia Davidson calls or refers to as an ideology of separation. So in terms of positioning, so borrowing from the poet Derek Walcott's metaphorical notion of the rot that remains, the scholar Anne Stoler argues that imperial formations cultivate debris which accumulates and has political lives. Stoler thinks of debris not just as the leftovers of imperialism and colonialism, but rather as what people are left with, the social afterlife of structures, sensibilities, and things. Her concept of imperial formation registers the ongoing quality of processes of decimation, displacements, and reclamation. And related to this, ruination shifts the emphasis from physical ruin to the ongoing nature of the imperial process. For Stoller, ruination is the deeply saturated, less spectacular forms in which colonialisms leave their mark. Ruination is a process that is ongoing, and to speak of colonial ruination is to trace the fragile and durable substance of science, the visible and visceral senses in which the effects of empire are reactivated and remain. And in some instances, particularly in the global south, museums, its buildings, practices, and societal relevance are literally in ruin. But more importantly, Stoller's concept of ruination is reflected in the museum idea, the ongoing, seemingly never-ending set of imperial logics about publics, representation, and consumption of the other that birthed the museum project. The museum idea can be thought of as a specter of colonialism that refuses to be exercised, and the particularities of its haunting might register differently in different contexts. For example, while many museums in Europe are faced with questions over and demands for restitution and repatriation of objects originating from Africa and other formerly colonized locations, museums in countries like South Africa are burdened with the upkeep and conservation of collections, buildings, ideologies, and epistemologies that were collected and that have accumulated during the colonial era and during apartheid. And so it is necessary to think critically about what we have inherited and what to do with that inheritance, particularly as this is becoming increasingly burdensome and troubling in the contemporary. While some collections and objects might have value, what does it mean to hold on to these objects collected in imperial and settler colonial contexts, when, as in the South African case, museum acquisition budgets are increasingly cut in the public sector and the buildings that house objects are falling into ruin? It may make more sense to think about revising and challenging policies to allow for the deacquisition of burdensome collections, to make rooms for new collections and new ideas about exhibitions and curatorial practices, and what museums can and should be for its various publics. So this idea of burdensome inheritances in terms of material and public culture is what the project, the chair, tried to grapple with in Stellenbosch. The exhibition was centered around the concept of a chair, as in head, seat, and object, and explored the relationship between the institutions of the university and the museum and their role in making meaning and knowledge. Diff was both the Prime Minister of South Africa and the Vice Chancellor of Stellenbosch University in the early apartheid era, and his office chairs from the 1940s are still meticulously preserved by the University Museum and held in their cultural heritage collection. The exhibition thinks through the notion of the ways that a banal object like a chair can be thought of as a witness and a supporting object, as it helped to upkeep and maintain a person and his ideologies at a certain time. And after that, it was bestowed to Stellenbosch University with the idea that what Malan, as politician and bureaucrat, did for South Africa was worthy of being protected, remembered, and saved for posterity. So the exhibition sought to juxtapose objects in the museum's own collection with sound interventions, performances, and displayed objects, also some video pieces, together from various collections that wouldn't normally be shown in the same display. And as we can see in this photograph, in the museum's archival room, this is the archival room for the social history or the cultural history and cultural heritage and anthropology collections. And here we can see the arbitrary divisions that are maintained between these two collections, or as one of the InZync poets who I collaborated with put it, white people stuff and black people stuff. And this is even though they were in the same room, but there were kind of all kinds of divisions that are evident through the way the objects are packaged, catalogued, and cared for. And this is just a detailed view of the random room dividers that were used to separate and differentiate between these two objects. And we can also see how the cultural history collections on the right are preserved in boxes and storage units. And on the other side, we have the anthropology collections that are stored on open shelves with no protective coverings. And then we have a similar case with the index cards, where they demonstrate the way that anthropology collections are thought of as made by unknown collectives, while the cultural collections are detailed with information on the object itself, the makers or origin of the objects, as well as acquisition information. And so this is what myself and or those kinds of issues are what myself and the InZync Poetry Collective sought to expose in our exhibition. And we mined the storeroom of this museum, similar to the way that I suppose Fred Wilson mined the Maryland Historical Society in the Mining Museum project. And we curated a selection of objects that we then kind of found through investigation and kind of, I suppose also, and I think Adrian will speak to this, but the kind of affective response that we got from working in the archive. The poets then responded to the objects with the purpose of speaking back. And these poems were recorded, and in the exhibition, they were attached as sound pieces to the objects on display to create a kind of the effect of a faint murmur of voices in the exhibition hall, which was quite a sinister space in itself. And here we have an image of the InZync collective performing their intervention, which was developed around the university's first Senate table that is part of the museum's collection and was also on display at the museum at the time. And what struck us when we looked at this object was the kind of at the Senate table was how intimate how small the table was in a way, and how intimate the spaces were between the chairs with the people that would have sat on these seats, and just thinking about those kinds of relationships. Okay, and so now I'm going to play a clip of, this is a photograph of what Wamui Mbao called a rap battle between Adrian, who calls himself Diff, and the bust of DF Milan. So the battle was called Diff versus DF. And I'm going to play a little bit of that. This was Adrian's response to this particular bust. And then, Adrian, I'm going to ask you to come in afterwards to maybe talk a little bit about your experience working on the project.
My feet stand steady on.
Can I just need to know if the sound is being heard?
You can hear it.
Okay, perfect.
My feet stand steady. Ooh. Shifting and skidding the soil, engraving my name into the earth's surface with my big toe. For too long, your legacy has tried to disturb how we flow and listen to the earth's biorhythms. Your ideas were not faced that the moon conveys messages of yesterday's unequal existences. Our presence in the strongholds of nostalgic advantage personify the phrase never again. Our artworks occupy corners, our poems disrupt eardrums, our voices protest, demonstrate, and activate change in an instant. Our mere presence in what is assumed to be historically yours causes the white supremacist capitalist patriarch to pop. We are genetically connected to the soil. Your lame appliance of pseudoscience tried to divorce us from the ground. Even Wilcox's report of 1938 could not separate our names from being written in the sun's rays by floating dust particles. Your commission and uninformed report tried to escort us from claiming the land. Building buffers between Buyong and Bash, you look at Zas, if your well-imagined violence will continue to perpetuate my silence. Our melanin bounces off the injustices of yesterday. They vibrate, resurrecting heritages murdered by colored classification. My blood shouts Batavia. My skin screams Namakwaland. My feet found home in the Kaila. My soul is a clenched fist that owns blackness. My eyes exhale spears at the sound of your death. Just remember, the 1960s ended a long time ago. My feet stand steady on this unstable ground, shifting and skidding the soil, engraving my name into the earth's surface with my big toe.
Adrian, I'm going to invite you to come to join and maybe speak a little bit about this and your experience of participating in the exhibition.
Thank you, Greer, and thank you, everyone. for having me. That was like listening to a previous version of yourself. And so every few years, Greer shows up and asks me to come and speak about this moment, which was, was one thing that really stood out about being in that archive, because we spent a long period of time in that archive. I think it was a month, like 4 weeks. There was a particular smell that the archive carried, and also I had like real like responses on my skin, which would really itch in a very bad way because of the dust in the archive. So one thing that was really like the violence of the archive was particularly there was a purposeful misremembering that would happen, where certain artifacts would be recorded in a particular way with a meticulousness. And this was particularly the like weird obscure things of Milan, like his letter openers would have these like really intense details about them, or his glasses that he wore, or a jacket that he wore. But the other artifacts from that were particularly misremembered, and this created experience of actually embodying what Stellenbosch was and still is, continues to be, is this misremembering of the contribution of that institution as the intellectual stronghold of apartheid, as the intellectual stronghold of eugenic thought. And as soon as these talks of decolonization come up in a place like Stellenbosch, it is only spoken about as in the abstract. You know, it's only spoken about in 150-word abstract. But the actual process of decolonization is something that the university still at ends with itself and still struggles with. And there's this particular way in which there's this willful forgetting that happens in Stellenbosch that basically passes down from generation to generation. And it feels like every time I go back, it becomes more and more aggressive, that willful forgetting. And in this space, when you walk down in the various roads from Victoria Street to Bird Street, the spatial design of Stellenbosch, it shows itself quite stark, in a stark manner, where there's no fences in this town, right? But there are various invisible fences that people walk around and don't feel welcome in the space. And these intellectual ivory towers continue to exclude and continue to extract. And where decolonization also becomes this just a word. There's no actual processes that it actually engages. And the process of writing this thing and of writing these responses was also the understanding how the curation of material culture there's a privileging as well in this remembrance. I think, like, Greer, are you there? We could maybe bounce more, because I feel like I'm just like speaking.
I'm here.
All right, but I'm just thinking about this. I mean, that makes sense what I said right now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about, like, maybe you could also speak about, I mean, I forgot to say at the beginning of the talk that also another connection between the three of us is as that we're all Stellenbosch survivors, that we all survived years in Stellenbosch. And I think maybe if you could also talk about, I mean, your work as a poet in Stellenbosch and the kind of work that you've done with InZync, for example, and the kind of just to contextualize the town for people that don't know it. And I mean, when I arrived there in 2015, I was shocked, even though I'm from the Western Cape. I did not know that some place like that existed. I was shocked by the university in many, many ways. And maybe you could talk a little bit to that, to just give some context to the space, the town.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. I mean, those violences in the university's particularly in the hostel culture, but in just the university's culture in itself, are still quite prevalent, and they exist till this day. You know, like every 6 or 7 months, then you hear these shocking stories that make headlines coming from a place like Stellenbosch, with real dehumanizing acts from one person to another, and it's usually across racial lines. And so there's this particular violence that still reemerges in this space, right? And it hasn't gone anywhere. And the university, it's got a really like a fascinating PR machine where everything gets spun, and there's always this one famous line that they say is that Stellenbosch University acknowledges its contributions to the past of South Africa. And they constantly repeat this line, right, whenever there's a racialized incident that happens. And then they go into denouncing the incident, but there's never a look into the particular violences that university and that the intellectual processes has contributed in South Africa, and particularly into this processes of eugenic thought. And still having really like disturbing ways of dealing with that and trying to, frame it. And so how our collective came about was out of a necessity to have spaces of speaking and reflection for students. And we would curate these sessions that would happen in Kayamandi, and try and create a purpose for two-way traffic, because usually it would only be that Bird Street, which is the street that connects Kayamandi and Clutisville to Stellenbosch. There would only be people that go from Kayamandi and Clutisville into the town at like 6 in the morning, and they would leave Stellenbosch again at 5 or 6 in the evening. And the idea was to create and to disrupt this movement. Essentially, my work is now always looking at Stellenbosch, because it's quite fascinating, this way of how amnesia kicks in a place like Stellenbosch, how there's this particular type of forgetting that happens, that as soon as you start to speak about the processes of 1948 and how 5 out of the 6 South African prime ministers were all students at Stellenbosch University. How 5 out of the 6 prime ministers of apartheid South Africa were basically also chancellors at the university. How currently right now I think the chancellor is still what's that guy's name? The South African. Rupert. Yeah, Rupert is still a chancellor there, right? So there's still this way in which the university has this weird underbelly that is quite stark of the Broederbond, and the whole Broederbond movement, which then happened in Stellenbosch as well. We had weird interactions as well, being a student in that place. And it is, again, I told Greer the other day, like, I needed a trigger warning looking at this different parts of the exhibition, because it took me back to what we were actually navigating, and how in the moment it looked quite like, it felt like we were just that, especially creating a space for people to speak in and for people to express themselves seemed like it was a normal thing. But right now, on the reflection, it was a necessity because of there being nothing like that. And then just back to the archive again, I'm really haunted by that smell of the archive. The smell of it was like really disturbing. It was this really like, it was stench, is what the best way I can describe it.
I wanted to ask you as well, so with this performance that you created in response to seeing the bust of Diff Milan, and again, we sort of wanted to look at this bust because we're thinking about how to unsettle the chair of an institution, so how to unsettle the person who occupies the chair in terms of thinking about it as a seat of power. And you felt quite strongly, because we went into this archive, we chose several objects that we could respond to in various ways. through video and sound and poetry, etc. And this object resonated with you, and you ended up creating this, which, you know, some people have referred to as a rap battle. And so I was just wondering, like, why did you choose this object, and what was the process of coming up with that response?
Yeah, so people were also saying but the object never spoke back. But my defense was that it was speaking back to me in the space of Stellenbosch that was created. So I would have to navigate that space every day, and that was the object speaking back to me, the violence of Stellenbosch, the particularly having to navigate the different zones of that place. And so why I wanted to also speak to this bust was that I also just wanted to, I wanted to spray on it. I wanted to like speak and have my words literally spray onto the bust as well. And that also, I don't know if you remember, right? But there was this one gentleman that was really not happy after this performance. And he was like the then dean of the humanities who was cool with us, had to like really get an earful from this person who was probably someone who held this Diff Milan in high regard.
I think they almost had a fist fight outside of the exhibition.
Yeah, exactly. It got like really heated, right? And so why I wanted that was because I wanted to also like look into this like past and like speak back and do something that I know someone that looks like me probably would never have the opportunity in the history of that town.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Adrian. I think we'll look at some of the other images, and so that we can still speak to Snotile's exhibition. Thank you so much for that, for sharing that. How do I move forward? Okay, so I'm just going to share some images from the exhibition and the juxtaposition of the various objects that we found in the archive, sort of building these sculptural spaces and landscapes with some of the objects and the chairs that we found. And then the other thing that we also did was, performing or creating video performances with the objects outside of the space, which I think I also got into trouble about. And then, projecting those, various videos that we had made in different parts of the town, and then projecting those videos onto the vitrines in the anthropology room, which was still organized the way that anthropology exhibitions were organized probably at the turn of the century. So that was also another important part of this intervention, was to create moving object, to kind of layer moving object or moving image, sound, the kind of rearranging the way that objects are displayed, and then also having, live performance elements in the museum as well. Okay, I'm going to invite Snotile to talk about her exhibition, Acquisition List, which she speaks about as a follow-on project to the chair. And this exhibition showed in 2021, also in the same museum. Snotile, can I invite you to join?
Hi, can you see me?
I can see you and hear you.
Okay. Hope you guys are good. So as Greer said, my name is Sinotile Gumede. Currently in KZN. I work for Amafa and Research Institute as a researcher there. Also into Stellenbosch. But yeah, what inspired my exhibition was actually Greer's work. So I worked at the Stellenbosch University Museum as a curatorial intern, and during my period as a curatorial intern, I made so many. Oh, that was in 2019. So I made so many interesting observations about the acquisition list and the collection, and it basically fits into everything that Greer had spoken about. So like one of, to take the study further, like one of the observations made was the fact that, even in those the objects of in from the fine arts perspective, the objects of Black people that were actually well documented, there was also an inequality there. So it was basically like within the margins there were actually other margins, and yeah, it basically speaks about how some objects are more equal than others, and also speaks directly to collections being difficult to display and some collections being way too controversial. And these are sort of the things that factored into me actually using the acquisition list itself, because as a bureaucratic document, it actually had so much voice, which also fits into why there's like a sound response to the exhibition. So I had cut out the names in the acquisition list, because the fear was, the objects, my concern was confronting the thingness of the objects and criticizing the thingness of the objects. So as a result, I decided to sort of cut out every word, every person, every object that has ever been listed in the acquisition list, and saying, actually, I'm opening up the space, which is why there's like spaces. I'm opening up the space for the acquisition list to be interrogated and for people to actually, because this is for me, it was really interesting because this is meant to be a private document. And now there's like POPA acts and everything. So it was a difficult document to grapple with. So me omitting the words on purpose was actually speaking to it was basically a critique to the institution, in that so many voices have been silenced, and so many voices in being included have actually excluded some, in a sense. So there's never, when it comes to the habits of collecting and the intentions behind the donations, whether it's from the donors or from the receivers, it's always blurred. And yeah, that's exactly what my work is about.
And just to say that you focused on the fine art collection. So while our project looked at the anthropology and cultural history collections, you were looking at the fine art department, as they call it. So just a question: why did you decide to look at that? What was your and how did you see it as a kind of follow-on from the chair?
As somebody who had so much exposure to the archive, I noticed that the work that you've done actually hits everything. It's on point, so it speaks directly to what's happening. But then I was wondering what that meant in the fine arts, when it comes to the fine arts collection. And I realized that in as much as it's not precisely the same, but then there's still the inequality when it comes to racial representation as well. There's so many work. If you look at the list, it's probably 98% white, and then the 3% is actually sorry, my math is very bad, but the remaining percent Black people. So this is something I connect to the institution itself when it comes to recruiting. This like the people who are going to be the faces of Blackness, and the faces of what it means to be, oh, we're so progressive, look at what we've done, we've done who a favor. You know, you should be happy you're in Stellenbosch. You're lucky. You the cream of the crop. Blah 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 blah. So that's basically what it speaks to as well. The fact that, you know, the acquisition list for some odd reason becomes a typical representation of that. That okay, we just going to sample out our black diamonds and they're gonna shine in the archives, whilst other voices are just unproperly catalogued and just drowning in the archives. So yeah.
Okay, let's listen to the audio from
Adams vir art
from this.
ongetiteld.
I'm just gonna play it. Oh, oops. Sorry, I wanted to play the audio. Okay.
Adams vir ongetiteld 1983 tyd op papier. Crayon on paper 1983 007 gekoop. Adams vir art e-pos 2 portefeulje 16 of 35 handgemaakte 2008 0208 van de Merwe Henty papier handmade paper. Adendorf SC Die Kuil Elandsspruit Oos TVL 1945 olie opdoek oil on canvas 2004 011 erflater. Lechinsky Pierre avec Medil Portier 1980 1985
Okay, I'm just going to move on to just showing the video that you sent of the installation. Okay, and then to say that you know, these projects, these kinds of interventions, obviously sometimes bring up more questions than, you know, or sort of further dilemmas rather than answers or productive ways of thinking about solutions to these problems. But it also brings up important questions around what we call decolonial fronting or posturing decolonial work. And I think we need to think about how we intervene, what kind of interventions are possible, and what the potential of artistic and curatorial interventions are in the museum institution, and particularly those institutions that are stubborn to change, like the US Museum. So yes, I think I'll stop it there and we can have a conversation. I'm seeing that it's already 5:04. Thanks, Sinatemba.
Thank you so much, Greer, Snotile, and Adrian, for this generative discussion. It's brought up a lot of questions. Maybe I'll begin by making or referring to a quote. Thinking about maybe moving around, I guess the ordered architectonic logic of the environment, or rather Stellenbosch. One always is hit by the quote by from Zora Neale Houston's book How It Feels to Be Colored Me, where she says, "I feel most colored when I'm thrown against a sharp white background, just the, immense whiteness, the immersive whiteness that one is thinking or has to experience within that context in particular. But I was interested in you thinking around the concept of ruination and thinking with Anne Stoler about that. And I wanted to maybe touch on these affective and visceral registers of coloniality that Adrian kind of alluded to, the smell, the dust, and how they kind of then like figure also other questions, right? They prioritize another engagement of thinking about the processes of coloniality that go beyond the more than human, right? They kind of evidence more than human sensibilities. And maybe I wanted to linger around that and how you kind of see, processes of coloniality within the institutional logic of, the museum itself, and what was the response to your interventions, right? By not only people working within the context of the museum, but like within the wider environment of Stellenbosch as, as a, I guess, yeah.
Okay, I think Adrian, you can also come in here if you where you feel you need to. I think maybe I'll start from the back. So Adrian already spoke a little bit about the response. And I also wanted to say that the exhibition, the chair, was also positioned within a particular historical moment of Open Stellenbosch, Roads Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, which happened during 2015. So the town, which is already quite polarized in its structure, in its social structure, in its architectural structure, and its affective structure, became even more increasingly polarized during that time. And it was quite, I feel like it was quite fraught and emotionally taxing to be a student and then later working at the university because of that kind of, I suppose, the kind of affective structure of coloniality that keeps those relationships, those power relationships in place. The exhibition was received mostly quite well. But we did have a few violent responses, which is like unbelievable. But as Adrian said, there was a man who was related to the Diff family who came and kind of shouted in the space and had a fight with the Dean of Humanities, who was very supportive quite supportive of student activism. And he was later fired or like quietly had to resign because of that. So it was a kind of a very kind of politically charged, polarized, tense environment. And things that would kind of be laughable elsewhere, in terms of the way the kind of extreme right-wing terrorism. I think, it's quite serious there with students actually kind of getting hurt, like bodies getting attacked, people getting attacked, Black students getting attacked, ending up in hospital. We saw a lot of those kinds of, it's awful. And so there was that kind of response, also because the space was so charged, affectively charged at the time. But I think, I think when you talk about the more than human, what has always struck me is, Adrian's talk about the trees in Stellenbosch. And Adrian, maybe you want to share a bit of this, but this is something that like I've been thinking about a lot since my time there, is how even the trees are sick. So there are oak trees, a lot of kind of the landscape is also kind of formulated to look like Europe, the physical landscape, the built environment. And Adrian talks about the trees as having cancer, as being ill. Like the trees actually have to be felled at some point because they're all sick. And so like thinking about the toxic nature of that environment and settler colonial displacement and and I want to say like terror, and how it affects not just people and social relations, but all these other there's all these other registers that are being affected that we sometimes can't see, but we can definitely feel. And so like a lot of our project was like thinking about that and how to bring those feelings to the surface as well. Adrian, do you want to talk a little bit about your diagnosis of the trees?
Sure. No, I mean, also like Stellenbosch is also just the town in itself. There's really big tensions between the actual community and the university, because Stellenbosch is also the place in where the pet project of the Group Areas Act was first instituted. So the forced removals of people from what was known as Diff, which was in the center of the town, to make space for the Arts and Social Sciences building, which was then named after Prime Minister, the apartheid Prime Minister B.J. Vorster, was a really like violent memory that was imprinted on the community. And many people were 5 or 6 years old, still have really clear memories of that moment. And the university was trying to just, do this thing of, again, we acknowledge our contributions to the history of South Africa, but without coming with actual, the question of us, what were they apologizing, right? The apologies were quite empty and were always just this performance of saying, oh, we're sorry, okay, let's move on. And then having these ceremonies of like saying sorry but there's actually no actual policy changes that can make those reparations or those apologies mean something for the surrounding community. Well, again, you had people who worked the amount of people that worked at that university for over 30, 40 years, 50 years, and whose children couldn't study there, right? The amount of theft of Black people's ideas that happened at that university, with like white professors co-opting ideas and traveling the world on Black people's trauma, extracting it and going to present at conferences around the world, still happens, right? That still happens in these, and you have departments that are completely untransformed. Just to throw it out there, just Google the visual arts department of Stellenbosch University and see who's sitting there. It's crazy to see that there's a real lack of understanding as well in that space.
I want to include Snotile into the conversation, so I'll maybe think around questions of methodology. Snotile, I was quite interested in this inversion that you kind of perform through the processes of redaction, right? Redacting the names from this acquisitions list, but then kind of highlighting in that method in and of itself, you kind of highlight these omissions and silences and kind of what is attempted by the institution to, what they attempt to make hidden still. And maybe I'd be interested in thinking about that as a methodological provocation, particularly within also the logic of, the Stellenbosch Museum, University Museum.
Sorry. Yeah, it's actually, the point you've just raised is quite interesting, because that was also part of the inspiration for my exhibition. What do you call it? The reductionist documents in the apartheid era. So there were certain things that, were highlighted and then people were not supposed to see. And this document itself being the bureaucratic document that people aren't allowed to see. So I think it would be interesting as well to actually have it, as you put it, a methodology of some sort, because so many there are so many voices in the omissions themselves. So yeah, I don't even know if I answered your question. Yeah.
I might open up, well, I want to open up the discussion for also the people in the chat room. Does anyone have a question and or statement or just a general observation regarding the presentation today? Okay, maybe. Okay, no.
No, no, I actually wanted to add, as an intern there, one of the things I would experience would be the place was oddly cold. It was colder than most spaces, number one. Number two, if you moved around the space, you'd find, when you have a puppy, you'd find like strands of golden lion hair. And those things the strands were quite telling of the audience, who's represented and who feels welcomed in the space. So the hollowness of the space and the coldness itself would somehow metaphorically speak to the ideas of, oh, actually, this place is so cold, I can't be here. And with all these strands of hair, I just feel like these are the people who are meant to be here. These are the people who the exhibitions are made for. And these are the people who everything in the collection speaks to. So yeah, the museum was free as well, but it just didn't make sense why Black people didn't want to come to the museum. But then it just speaks again to the violent nature of the works that are being displayed, and the ways in which works are selected, because displays are more different from the collections and what's in the archive together. So yeah.
Snotila, I know that like part of these projects, kind of you're thinking through them with your PhD process. So maybe also, Greer, you also were thinking through these ideas, right, through your PhD. How do you see the projects kind of living or their afterlives beyond, I guess, within the context of Stellenbosch, and also just thinking through your process also?
Yeah, I think this is what we're thinking about in terms of, this kind of practice, which is quite popular in Europe, where in European museums, where practitioners, artists are invited into the museum to try and kind of decolonize displays, collections, practices, etc. This is what I was kind of trying to think through with my PhD. And I think that, this kind of, we have to ask ourselves, I suppose, what are the futures for these sites? What are the possibilities for museums going forward? I think that's the bigger question. Coming in and doing temporary projects, yes, it may kind of expose some of the power logics embedded in that institution, but how does it radically transform what those institutions actually mean and what they do and what they, the position that they occupy in society. So I think Adrian and I are looking to return to this project, maybe to think about, because one of the reasons why we wanted to kind of do this reflection with both projects is to also show how from 2015 to 2021, nothing really changed. So in other words, the interventions that I didn't really have an impact on the practices, the everyday practices of the museum. And so, thinking, I think we have to think about what the point is, what the point of these projects are in spaces like, and how we ourselves as creative practitioners get co-opted into, performing this kind of thinking. so Adrian and I are currently thinking about this, and we had hoped to make a new intervention by the time of this presentation, but time and space did not allow. But we are thinking about that in future, how to reflect on this, you know, in a different kind of way, because I'm not convinced that working in a museum actually does anything, or kind of working as a creative practitioner in an interventionist way in a museum. I'm not sure it leads to the kind of dismantling that we think it might. Yeah, so that's from my perspective.
Yeah, I think also just to make a statement in relation to what you just articulated, a lot of the time, right, like institutions like usurp like decolonial or like co-opt decolonial intervention. And we're imagining them as practitioners as shifting some kind of ground in some essence, but more so what becomes the relevance of our projects, right? When like the institutional makeup or the fabric or like the structure remains the same. It's still those same people working in those positions. And, you know, it's them being able to co-opt the language of a decolonial spaces while simultaneously also like, you know, the structures remaining exactly what, you know, one takes it with. And
what kind of aesthetic? Because they also think about it in you know in an aesthetic way, or kind of rearranging the furniture, but that doesn't do anything to you know to the actual structure of the place, as you say, and the systems that are in place.
Yeah. Mulumko had made a statement on the chat.
Hi.
So I'm like
Sorry.
calling you out.
I had started typing it out, and then I was like, it's gonna be too convoluted to type for people to be able to follow. But just like a comment in relation to, I guess, what Greer is saying in terms of like impact and like whether these gestures like actually do the work that they're supposed to do. I personally, after having experienced during undergrad the difficulty of having like access to certain archives, which I thought were really important to myself and just in general, like Black people, people of color living in South Africa, I think it's an absolutely like incredible and important gesture that is necessary. I think it like opens up space, ways of thinking of space and accessibility. And these things, I guess, like often in the moment, maybe don't feel as significant as they are, but in retrospect actually are. So I didn't know about these projects that you all were doing, but now that I know about it, I'm so excited. And I don't know, I think it just really opens up the possibility of like an artistic practice. Because I'm doing my master's now, we recently kind of did a discussion and a reading of Fred Wilson's work, and I really appreciate like that gesture of intervening in an environment that could possibly be, or oftentimes is extremely violent, but the way in which like you can create propositions that are so weighted and rich in gesture without recreating the violence that may have come from like these objects, and like looking at the interior, in inverted commas, lives of like objects and how they travel and the ways in which they get instrumentalized in different ways. So I really am excited by these projects that you guys did. And I think they're super impactful and significant. And I understand there's the question of like, but who does the power actually sit with? But I think when you're activating the space in like public ways like that, it's so important in terms of like who's coming into contact with it and like how that shifts their relationships to like spaces like museums or archives or collections that feel like they're this very, I don't know, this kind of overwhelming infrastructure that can't really be shifted or changed, or like have narratives that intersect in different ways to what like was given to us by whatever institution it comes from. So I think these things are really important. And I would like just say like continue doing it, like whether, yeah, I don't know, that's just me.
Thank you, Bulumko. That's good to hear.
Claudia has their hand raised.
Hi. Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I guess what I'm thinking, I guess in response to Greer, Adrian, and Snotila's fascinating talk, and I'm also still thinking of your recent event with Nonto about, I would say, this lip service regarding the decolonization of these collections. So a little background, I work on my dissertation looking into Black women artists under apartheid more broadly. And I tried to access both the archive of the Stellenbosch University Museum and same at WITS. And in reality, one institution spent more time diligently and repeatedly talking me out of visiting their archive, giving me reasons of either supposedly being in the process of reworking the physical archive, or the other institution meant I was almost, or probably in fact, yelled at for having a research focus on Black South African women artists. So I don't know, so maybe I need a trigger warning too regarding those white gatekeepers. But I guess what I may be realizing is that these university archives are perhaps at some point open for their students, yet maybe less so for outside researchers. And I guess yet, as Greer has pointedly asked, what are the futures of these collections and institutions, and what are the specificities of being in the global South? Yet, as you've said, what is the point of this or these spaces then?
Yeah, I also think, the ephemeral nature of these kinds of projects, I mean, it does make me think about how we also archive these responses. So, for instance, there have been other responses to this museum, but they're not all in one place. And I didn't even know about Snotila's exhibition until we met, in a social context. And so, I think thinking about how to archive interventions is maybe something that we should also think about in these spaces. And maybe only then, when we start looking at them as related to each other and how they speak to each other, can we also think about how to take that forward and to, use that to initiate real structural and systemic change. So maybe that's another layer that needs to happen on top of this. But thank you both for your comments. They were both very helpful and generative.
I'm going to again ask if there are any comments or questions in the audience, and then okay, I think we'll end there for today. Thank you so much, Greer. It was a very illuminating discussion on, like, I guess, a very, very tricky and tenuous environment. Stellenbosch is a weird environment to negotiate. I haven't been there for a considerable amount of time, but the times I've been there, I've always felt so unsettled. And it's quite interesting to think around the various interventions that are happening within that environment. I'm hoping we can engage each other again, thinking around these questions, but we already do within the context of our department. I am filled with gratitude that you honored my invitation and came for this last session, and thinking with the practitioners who've been a part of, like, this para-curatorial project has been quite interesting, and I feel very honored. And it's the last session, which I am somewhat emotional about, because, UCT, particularly Nomusa and Amu, have provided the space for us to have moments of reflection, which are very generative and have been very productive. And I'm highly grateful for that. So I'd like to also extend my thank you to you, Nomusa and Amu, for all the wonderful work you do at Creative Knowledge Resources. It's much needed within this context. And I think, it keeps on, giving us the impetus to continue working. So thank you.
Yeah, no, we wanted to thank you for putting this whole program together. Greer, thank you so much for this brilliant presentation. I think it's a fantastic way to end the series, but Snetemba, the concept, the selection of speakers, just putting all of that together and facilitating the entire thing. I know I wasn't able to be there for each and every one, but I think it's been really brilliant the way that you've carried it, and I think it just sets a high bar in future. But thank you so much. Thank you so much. And to all our attendants, I know it's not always many because it's the end of the year and everyone is tired, but we really appreciate everyone's presence and inputs and the discussions that have enriched the space. To Amo, you are always here and always just making sure things happen, so we really do appreciate everything that you put in. It's recognized. We see you. And thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you.
Oh gosh, one doesn't want this journey to end.
Where's the after party? Thank you everyone. It's been
wine to everyone.
Yeah, no, I think we need it. We're going into exams, so
Yes.
we're all good.
But wonderful end of the year to everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. See you soon.
Thanks, Notile and Adrian.
Thank you. Bye.